Hello, Dr. Ronnie Steenberg. Welcome to Voice of East Turkestan program. I am Rukia Turdush, East Turkestan and China relations researcher. I am so privileged to invite you today. How are you?
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's a privilege for me to be here. A great honor. I'm doing well. Thank you very much. How are you?
Good, thank you. I would like to introduce you quickly. Dr. Steenberg is a very good friend of Uyghurs. He's an anthropologist. Research interests concerns the historical development of Uyghur kinship practices and the conceptualization in East Turkestan. Together, we explore today the historical and the contemporary parallels between East Turkestan and Palestine. I hope this conversation offers deep insights into the lived experiences of these two nations, examining illegal occupation, cultural survival, and international solidarity. To explore these similarities and the differences, could we talk based on political perspective, how international relations played key role in these two nations' colonial status when they were colonized?
Yes, certainly. So, first of all, I think that there is a very interesting and a very fruitful parallel between these two cases, and looking at them, I think will help us see things about both cases that we might not have seen before. Um, I would say the what ties them together is the colonial nature of the situation in East Turkestan and Palestine, respectively, both of which are today settler colonies, but with very different histories of their creation, and that is what you're asking about right now, correct?
Yep,
Yeah.
exactly.
So. Um, East Turkestan was colonized by the Qing Empire in 1759 and has been under Chinese occupation for most of the time since 1759. There have been phases of independent states being created on parts or sometimes very big parts of what is today considered East Turkestan, what the Chinese called Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And since 1949, since 1949, I would say we can also consider the region a settler colony, because that is when the Chinese state, then the newly established People's Republic of China, started moving Chinese settlers in larger numbers, in great masses.
Exactly.
There, the international community basically recognized the PRC, the People's Republic of China, little by little. First, it was the Soviet Union who supported it, and they accepted and recognized that East Turkestan would become a part of the People's Republic of China. So the last few years before the establishment of the People's Republic of China, East Turkestan was an independent republic, or the north, we could say, of East Turkestan, what's also called Jungaria, um, was an independent republic that fought against the Chinese Republican army, just like the communists did as well. And they then um, merged, or more precisely, were taken over by the PRC. So, but officially they were not conquered, but chose to become part of China. And the Soviet Union was very involved in this negotiation. De facto, it meant that the whole region went from being a colony, first under Qing Empire and then under Republican Chinese, what we call Kuomintang, those who later went to Taiwan and established the Chinese Republic in today's Taiwan, was a colony under those two entities and then became a settler colony under the PRC. And there were attempts of earlier states So states that were established by the local indigenous population, those we today call Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Tajiks, and so on. But the Uyghurs played a very big role because they are the main and largest population of the area, to reach out to the international community and get recognition and support for the states that they had tried to establish in the meantime. There was a state in the late 19th century, and then there was a state in 1933 around Kashgar, and then again 1944 around Hulja. So I would say, and they didn't get that support, and they didn't get that recognition. As for Palestine, now I must say that I know a lot less about Palestine because I am a scholar of the Uyghurs and of the Uyghur regions, but especially because of the ongoing genocide that we're seeing in Palestine, especially in Gaza, and because of my engagement both with scholars, activists, and refugees from the region, I've learned quite a bit. I would say just a lot more than I used to know about the region. And so if we compare it with the Uyghur regions, we could say that the colonial situation in Palestine also started quite early, though not as early. Well, yes, also started quite early with the Ottoman Empire colonizing the region, then the British taking it over, splitting what was called the Levant with the French after the end of World War One and the destruction of the Ottomans. That's very much in parallel to East Turkestan being colonized by the Qing, and the Qing ends around the same time that the Ottoman Empire ends, a few years before, or yeah, almost a decade before, but still historically speaking, around a very similar time. And then there is a phase of British occupation and colonialism until 1949, when the state of Israel is established on a large part of the Palestinian territory. And this also then becomes a settler colonial state. Before the settling through Zionist immigrants had already started in the late 19th century, but it's with the establishment of Israel as a state, as a Jewish state, particularly on Palestinian territory, and the full recognition of that by the international community, that it becomes a settler colony or a settler colonial state.
That's a very sad. Like both Palestinians and East Turkestan has become the pawn of big powers. They suffering their independence has suffered the large calculation of these big powers, right?
Yes. Well, basically, we can say that up until the end of World War II and maybe even into the 70s, the what you could call international community, which is a euphemism, usually meaning the West and other great powers, have been accepting of colonialism, has seen colonialism as legitimate. I mean, a lot of the countries that are today seen as the core of the international community, like Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Canada, and many, you could argue, South American countries as well, even though that's a bit more complicated, are in essence colonial states that were established on the genocides or eradications of the indigenous populations there. So there is a general acceptance in the spirit of modernization and in the spirit of the civilizing mission, what was called the white man's burden, to lift the uncivilized populations out of their misery and make them civilized. There was an acceptance that this is something legitimate, it's okay to do, and the loss that it entails in lives and in cultures is regrettable, but serves a larger purpose. And that, of course, is an ideology that seeks to legitimize colonization taking away other people's land and forcefully assimilating them or subduing them to become laborers or pariah in their own country. And that's an ideology that today we see in Israel very clearly in relation to the Palestinians, and that we see in China very clearly in relation to the Uyghurs and other minoritized and colonized populations in East Turkestan.
But it's when China invaded East Turkestan, that was a decolonization period, right? I think I because we failed to become independent at that time, despite that East Turkestan already established East Turkestan Republic because of the Soviet influence, because they helped us to establish second East Turkestan Republic, but Stalin quickly gave up, abandoned East Turkestan Republic and collaborate with China because he want to make Mongolia independent buffer state between USSR and Japan, both Japan and China, right? And China doesn't want to give up the Mongolia, so he traded with China and abandoned East Turkestan. And even he forced to, no, I mean, not forced, encouraged Mao to invade East Turkestan. The faster, he said, he sent a telegram. And he also provided military aid to Mao, China to invade East Turkestan, yes. Right? So like, and UN, I mean, not UN, US and Western countries could not involve because they were, that East Turkestan was not their strategic project object at that time. They were mainly focused on flashpoints of Cold Wars in Europe, right, and Indo-Pacific. That's why, and I think they don't want to provoke conflict between USSR because that was a new Cold War era, right? Just the World War II justice end, and they also lost China because the Kuomintang, like you say, they defeated by the Communist China and escaped Taiwan. That's why the U.S. not interested into involved with the East Turkestan's issue.
Well, the U.S. lost basically. The U.S. was supporting the Kuomintang. If they would have supported an independent Uyghur or East Turkestani state, if the Kuomintang had won, is up for discussion. I don't think they would have. They didn't before, and there's also no reason you could say from their perspective. Because they had the Kuomintang as their allies, and they were working with them, and so they would want them to have as much of these natural resources as possible. But yes, the Soviet Union supported China in establishing the People's Republic of China and also in fighting against local attempts at indigenous autonomy or independence of the nations of East Turkestan. And this didn't just start actually in 1949. It actually already started with the first East Turkestan Republic in 1933, which was conquered and destroyed with the help of Soviet troops. And even before that, Yakub Beg's, or with Soviet support at least, and even before that, Yakub Beg's Kashgaria, which was, you could say, the first organized attempt at an independent state after the Qing conquest, was also destroyed with the help of then Russia. So there, I think if we take a step back and look at it in a larger perspective, we could say that the big powers are dividing the land up between themselves. They strike deals. They take East Turkestan for Mongolia. They give Mongolia for East Turkestan. They sacrifice the small parts. Similar thing we see in the Levant, where after the destruction of the Osmanic Empire, France took Lebanon and Britain got Palestine, and it was divided up amongst each other, and then they ended up giving parts of it to the Jewish people who had just survived probably the most horrendous genocide that till this day still has been committed, the Holocaust. But they gave them a land that was not theirs to give.
Uh-huh.
Just like the Soviet Union gave China a land that was not theirs to give, which was East Turkestan, and Britain, France, and the international community, the winners of World War II, basically gave the Jews a land that was not theirs to give because it belonged to someone else, to the people who were living there and had been living there for centuries. And in Palestine's case, this also included Jews. There were Jews who were living there, but most of the population was Muslim, and um, there were also Christians, all of whom saw themselves as Palestinians. Um, and in East Turkestan, it was a land that was mainly inhabited by Turkic-speaking Muslims, also Mongols, also some Chinese, but they were mainly the colonial administrators who had been brought in uh, by the colonial powers. So these lands were basically handed out amongst
Yeah.
and negotiated amongst the great powers.
Yeah.
And the local populations were not given any kind of real say in that, even though it was, as you say, officially the decolonial era. Um, you could say these areas were not decolonized because they were
Exactly.
just shifted from one colonial sphere to another, in a sense.
Exactly. Exactly. So that's very insightful information to our audiences. Could you tell us how these two nations' cause differ significantly in their uh, legal recognition, international leverage, and the forms of resistance?
Yes. So, as for the legal recognition, Palestine was established along with Israel officially. There was to be a Palestinian state. The UN Charter um, makes plans for both an Israeli, a Jewish state that is called Israel, and a Palestinian state. Um, but de facto, that has never been established. And in the wars in the region that followed, Israel has taken and occupied more and more parts of what was originally the supposed to be the Palestinian state. The Palestinian state was also split up between two parts, but legally speaking, it was, uh, it is kind of, it should be there. And now today, especially since the onslaught of the genocide in Gaza, more and more countries are recognizing Palestine as a state, but de facto, um, Palestine is administered by forces that are very much subject to Israeli control. And we can get into that maybe later, but basically there is no de facto independence. It's very, very much a dependence. As for East Turkestan was, as far as I know, never recognized by the international community. Um, I'm actually not sure of the two East Turkestani republics. I know that the first one tried to get recognition from Britain and Russia, but was not granted this recognition. The second one, I believe, was recognized by the Soviet Union, but I don't know if they were recognized by others. And I mean, de facto, they were also sort of recognized by the PRC. When this was established, they were then just included into it, um, the way the Chinese portrayed it, voluntarily. But of course, as we know, that wasn't the case. There's this whole story where the leaders of the Second East Turkestan Republic were supposed to go to Beijing for negotiations, where possible full independence was still on the table, and then disappeared on their way there. And it was then decided that they would be part of
Yeah,
China. So
Yeah, sorry, I cut you off. Many Uyghurs
Go ahead.
believe that the Stalin orchestrated to kill those Uyghur leaders through mysterious plane crash, but we
Right.
don't have enough evidence. But many Uyghurs
No.
believe that.
Yes, and for good reason. I think
Yeah.
there are plenty of reasons to believe that that could have been the case. It wouldn't have been the first time. It wouldn't have been the last time. Both Stalin and Mao were mass murderers, and they were very happy to just take people out that weren't who didn't fit into their um, program, their politics, and so on and so forth. So, as you say, we don't have the evidence, but it is highly likely. And if we look at it from a larger perspective, not that it doesn't matter, of course, human lives matter always, but whether they were killed or died naturally, or even if they had made it to Beijing, I don't think it would have made any difference, because this is not about the individuals. It's about a very powerful nation
Mhm.
and its historical claims to legitimacy over a land that it has colonized. And in that sense, the PRC is just the successor nation of the Qing Empire. And indeed, they made sure to include all, basically all the former areas that had been conquered by the Qing, even though they were very much against the Qing, which they saw as feudal overlords and um, oppressors and so on and so forth. But still, um, they took over the entire land and became a sort of
Yeah, I want to add quick
colonial power.
comment here. I want to add very quick comment here because China always said East Turkestan is inseparable part of China, right? I think
Right,
East Turkestan, and we believe that Uyghurs believe, and other East Turkestanian people believe that East Turkestan should be recognized as an illegally occupied nation by international community because China always claimed that East Turkestan is inseparable part of China, and that claim is totally baseless. If we look at the Manchu history, for example, the Manchu Empire invaded China in 1644. And at that time, it was Ming Dynasty, not China. And the Manchu controlled Ming Dynasty, and they referred Ming Dynasty as to China, that Ming Dynasty's territory to China, and referred the Han people live in Ming Dynasty's territory as Chinese, right? So
right,
besides, the Manchu conquest of China was more than 200 years earlier than Manchu conquest of East Turkestan. That's mean East Turkestan was not part of Ming Dynasty. So China claiming that East Turkestan is inseparable part of China since ancient times, since Han Dynasty is totally baseless because Han Dynasty itself is many years before than the Ming Dynasty, and East Turkestan was not even part of Ming Dynasty. And even in the
right,
recent history, like you explained, you told us right now, the shortly lived East Turkestan Republic that established in 1933 and 1944 were 5 years before than the PRC's establishment in 1949. But China
right,
always claimed that there's a peaceful liberation of East Turkestan. Peaceful liberation from who? The East Turkestan Republic already liberated itself, that the territory, the most part of the territory north, and they are
right,
still fighting over there for the south, right? And they liberated them from the warlords and Manchu Empire. So liberated from who? This is very ridiculous. And in fact, if that's the peaceful liberation, why people against the China are resisting until today? There's neither peaceful liberation and nor voluntary unification through referendum with
right,
China. So, and if we look at the situation today, the international community, the international world should recognize East Turkestan as an occupied nation as defined at Article 42, 1907 Hague Regulation, because this regulation clearly stated that the territory is considered occupied when it's actually placed under the hostile army, the authority of hostile army. East Turkestan is under the heavy occupation of PLA and Chinese armed police, and Chinese people's armed police, and more than 3 million Xinjiang production and construction corps. these forces there, all of them are armed forces, and these forces there to implement genocide and to target the East Turkestanian people, to repress them, and they're very hostile. So the East Turkestan should be recognized as an illegally occupied territory, but it's so hard because of China's power and influence.
Yes, and also because um, East Turkestan was not recognized as a country before 49, not by the international community. And I think if it had been, then there would have been a much stronger case in, say, international law for the exact.
But
Uh,
yeah, well, yeah, I agree with you, but recognizing the countries by other countries, I think it's totally political, that when the
of
country is
course,
interested, yeah, they recognize. If they're not interested, then they don't recognize. And nobody recognizing Taiwan right now too, right?
right.
The Taliban government not recognized. So
Yes,
it's a very political. It's not legal.
political. It is very political, but the there's no clear distinction between the legal and the political in this sense,
Oh,
because
yeah,
the
exactly. You're right.
international law has been created by nations and it's being used and abused by nations, and there is no um, larger authority over it all with any kind of sanctioning power. So there
That's
is, of course, the UN, but the UN has a tiny budget, and they have no military or police power. They have no ways of actually implementing. They're not like a global government or anything like that. So it's always the recognition of the support of the individual countries that is going to determine whether a country gets to either be recognized as an occupied territory or maybe even get the help to change that and to no longer be occupied.
Yeah. So we just talk about how these two nations differ significantly in their legal recognition, international leverage, and forms of resistance. Each has this next advantage, like you said, and disadvantages. In your opinion, do these unique characteristics play a significant role in whether their struggles succeed or fail? For example, does the fact that the Palestinian people's struggle is receiving more international support and recognition compared to the East Turkestan struggle will give them an advantage and make the establishment of an independent Palestinian state more likely? Or, on the contrary, does this international support increase the threat perception of the opposing side, their enemy, so leading them to try harder to eliminate Palestine and creating dangerous or endless situation?
Yeah, so I would say, generally speaking, both of these nations right now have a very limited chance of actually realizing a full de facto state, independent state with control of its own borders, and so on and so forth. The Palestinian state I mean, it already exists as a state, and it's recognized not by all, but by some and by an increasing number of countries. So, as a legal entity, it has a much better chance of existing and continuing to exist um, going forward than East Turkestan. But it also, through that, is has become um, because of the power politics of the United States and its close connection to Israel and Israel's role as the United States ambassador and policeman in the Middle East. It has taken a lot of, you could say, like war acts and destruction of life
Yeah.
and infrastructure and so on and so forth. And this didn't hasn't just started in the last 2 years, but it's something that's been ongoing for longer. It has become a war zone in part because it can't be as neatly controlled as East
Mm.
Turkestan can be controlled by the Chinese. So East Turkestan doesn't have a recognition as a country, I think, by anyone in the international community. The legal basis for doing this is not yet established, and it would take quite some time and some work. And also, as you say, the cause of the Uyghurs and other people of East Turkestan in the international community is not yet um, as strongly established for many various different reasons as the Palestinian cause. So it is at the moment de facto under the full control of the PRC. And that means that the prospects of it becoming a state going forward are very slim at this moment. But it also means that warlike acts of killing and destruction are less likely to take place and do take place much less than in Palestine, for instance. But that doesn't mean that violence doesn't take place. Of course, um, state violence takes place a lot, and hundred thousands of Uyghurs and other minoritized people are incarcerated, much larger numbers than, for instance, we see in Israel and Palestine, as something many people don't really know much about. Um,
Exactly.
and the control of the population is horrendous, both in the sense of limiting mobility, of limiting communication with the outside world, including relatives outside, and so on and so forth. So it does mean East Turkestan is much closer controlled by China than Palestine is by Israel. Um, but therefore, it both both places experience extreme violence, but um, war types, bombings, and these kind of things are therefore a lot less frequent in East Turkestan than in Palestine.
Hmm. Why am I asking you this question? Because some of my people avoid talk about independence and avoid anything that criticize the Chinese government because they believe that those people are maybe very few people. They believe that this will cause threat perception of the Chinese government or
Mhm.
excuse for the Chinese government to kill Uyghurs. But I think
Right.
they ignore the fact that China using systematic oppressive tactics, gradually killing Uyghurs since they have invaded, even though Uyghurs has no capacity to threat China. The China implemented genocide against Uyghurs despite the international community never supported the independence of East Turkestan and treated our cause, the East Turkestan's cause, as an internal matter of China, right? So I
Right.
think being Uyghur and preserve Uyghur identity considered as a threat by China. Being Palestine is considered as a threat by Israel. So I think fight for freedom against the enemy is very little to do with enemy's threat perception because their intention is clear over there. No matter what you fight or not, you gonna against them or not, they just they want to wipe you out. Your survival is threat for your enemy here. So I think so there's no need to worry about the threat perception, like of the enemy. What do you think?
Yes, I mean, so I would say the threat perception and the level of threat determines what kind of violence they will
Mhm.
exert. So the more there's a threat perception, and I do think, for instance, that in the early 2010s, when there were several um, armed attacks on Chinese police stations, sometimes even on markets in the Uyghur regions, that China called terrorist attacks. I don't think that's the right term to use for it, but they were also called so in the international press. That there was a rise in threat perception, and that this was in part resulted in the extreme state violence as a response from 2014 on, and then especially 2017, and in part was used by groups inside China who wanted to push ahead with the eradication of the Uyghur people as a group, and therefore took it as as a good excuse and a legitimization, just like Israel has taken the Hamas attacks and before that rockets and
Yeah.
the March of Return and all these things as a threat. I do think that some people in Israel do feel threatened by it, but there's also a very big group who is taking it in order to legitimize and further their own agenda. And the general agenda, I think is something that is very, very similar in the two countries. And that is also not untypical if we look at history. So this is basically the settler colonial agenda. And we've seen it in North America, in Australia, in South Africa, um, and in Kashmir, in many other places. Um, Patrick Wolf is a scholar of colonialism, especially settler colonialism, who has written about this. And I think his writings are very useful for understanding the situation in both these places. He writes that the settler colonial endeavor is focused on the land. They want the territory, they want the land. Sometimes they will also use the population for labor, but they are after the resources and the land, the territory. And because they have taken this land by force as a colonial power, they will always be reminded of their status as conquerors, as colonial power, um, by the fact that the local population is still there. And so their claims to legitimacy, and they always claim legitimacy with in different strategies. Interestingly, both China and Israel use a similar strategy to claim legitimacy over Palestine and East Turkestan by saying that we were here first. The Chinese say that there have been Chinese in East Turkestan before the Uyghurs came there in the 6th and 7th centuries. And Israel too uses a lot of archaeological evidence to show that, you know, the Israeli people, whatever that is or whoever they were there before the Palestinians came. Obviously, Jews existed before Muslims because Muhammad came a lot after Judaism was established. But so they have similar historical legitimizing strategies. Other places have had other types of strategies, especially the civilizing idea and so on and so forth. But what is common to all of them is that as long as the local, indigenous, righteous population still is there and has a claim to the land, they will be seen, in a sense, as illegitimate. So the goal in order to avoid that and to fully conquer the land, in a sense, is eradication. Eradication of the local population as such. And that can be done in several different ways. The most brutal and terrible way and most well-known way that unfortunately has happened many times is genocide. The killing off of the local population in a way that minimizes them so much that they basically cease to exist. Planned. This happened in the North Americas. That is what the US and Canada have been built on. Um, Another way of doing it is ethnic cleansing, which includes the forced movement of populations, either by chasing them away or by really taking them and putting them on trains or trucks or whatever, and taking them to another place. You could say that what happened in Palestine at the Nakba, even though a lot of people were also killed, but was more akin to ethnic cleansing in that sense, because it was almost 1 million Palestinians who were chased away from their homes violently, and a lot of them were killed on the way as well. But that was the chasing them off their land was sort of the main focus of that. And then there's the third way of eradication, which is basically forced assimilation. And this is something
Yeah.
that is more common in the modern era. Um, we see it in Kashmir. The Indian state is trying to force the Kashmir people to assimilate into a Hindu nationalist population. We saw it maybe the first time it was really expressed clearly was in the 19th century in the United States, where after having fought against the indigenous Native American population, the First Nation people, and defeated them and massacred them in huge numbers, giving them blankets with viral and bacteria that would kill their children when they slept under them, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
They shifted to a more humane tactic, which was described as kill the Indian, but save the man. So you would not completely kill them, but you would kill the Indian in them. You would kill their culture, their way of life. You would eradicate the language, their history, and so on and so forth. Also, in order to remove them not as persons, individuals, but as a people, as a community.
Ex-
And it never fully worked. There are still people today who see themselves as Native Americans, who have some kind of relation to that and try to do rituals and so on and so forth. But it eradicated most of it. None of the languages are really functional as a full language system where you can go to school in it and so on and so forth. And also many of the like philosophies and ways of thinking and so on have disappeared. And those who did hold on to a big part of being Native American or Indian, they were put in reservations, and they are those who economically have suffered some of the worst in the modern North America. And right now, I would say this is what is being done to the Uyghurs. There is a deliberate strategy to kill the Uyghur but save the man, as far as I know. So problem is we don't have free access to information on East Turkestan because I
yeah.
can't go since 2016. Even if I could, which some people can, no real research is possible on the ground because it would be too dangerous for the people we talk to. The Chinese government will be there straight away. Also, a similarity actually to Palestine, where it's also really dangerous, as we know, to report or research on the colonialism going on there because the colonial state will act against it with violence. It will punish the people who were in some way involved in it. So we
Yeah.
don't really know exactly what's going on, but what we can see from the outside, what we have evidence for is a massive destruction of Uyghur culture, of Uyghur language, of Uyghur communities, also as communities of Uyghur families as families. And this is all part of this attempt to eradicate the people as a people. Those who hold on to the Uyghur language, hold on to Uyghur cultures, they are ending up on the bottom of society, just like the Native Americans ended up on the bottom of American society with drug problems, alcohol problems, with poverty, with unemployment, with incarceration in a massive scale, and with no chances of succeeding in the modern society that their colonizers have turned their land into. Um, so, but we haven't, till today at least, seen mass killings on the scale where we would say the Chinese government is doing eradication through direct killing. We definitely have seen killings, and people have died in prison, died from torture, uh, been um, um, been sentenced to death, uh, and so on and so forth. And everybody who has stood up and tried to show resistance, especially armed resistance, has been
Mhm.
killed mercilessly. But we haven't, at least so far, seen mass killings, mass graves, these kind of things. Not necessarily because they don't exist. Maybe it's just because we don't see them. And I know that some people from the region say that it does exist, but so far the evidence of that I haven't seen. And to be honest, for me, also it doesn't make so much sense within the Chinese politics because they need the laborers, they need the workers, they need the legitimacy, both in the in international eyes and within the country itself. And the way they do it now, which is a very violent form of forced assimilation, of killing the Uyghur but saving the man, is much more cost effective, is much more profitable for them. And after all, it is a very capitalized, money driven society. And I, yeah, so I think that that is what's happening. And it is eradication because it's destruction of the culture, of the language, and so on and so forth. And it is exactly as you say, because if the Uyghur language, culture, and social memory can be destroyed or altered,
Mhm.
then the Chinese claims to legitimacy over this land can be consolidated,
Mhm.
and no one will question it
Yeah.
much
Yeah.
afterwards.
Exactly. I totally agree with you. Even though the China, the bombed and they killed the Uyghurs and other Turkic people in East Turkestan before the world, yeah, in front of the world, like the Israel doing to the Palestinians right now. But
Right,
they using very covert methods, and they using euphemistic languages like a poverty alleviance, re-education,
right,
they're like orphanage care, orphanage camps, those kinds campaigns. But end result at the end is the same, like you say, they totally destructing the Uyghur community, Uyghurs and other Turks, or the destructing the family, individuals one by one. Just
right.
like you said, like more profitable, everyone become Chinese, work for them. Yeah.
Yes, or they become someone who work for the Chinese and who are afraid to speak up against them. I mean, they basically break the resistance
Mm-hmm.
and turn people into meek sheep who will who will voluntarily walk to the butcher basically or go to the factory and like do whatever they need to do in that sense. Yes.
That is very scary situation. Do you think in what ways have the Palestinians or people of East Turkestan been more successful or less successful in their respective resistance strategies when compared with one another?
So, you know, it's really difficult. It kind of depends what you're aiming for
Yeah.
and what you're hoping for. I think generally over long term speaking, the Uyghurs have been more successful in surviving, in being killed less. But the Palestinians have definitely been more successful in gaining the world's attention and gaining support, first of all, in the Arabic world, which the Uyghurs have not been able to do in Central Asia in the same way. It has changed a little bit now with the re-education camps, but and there are some similarities because while Palestinians have a lot of support in the Arabic populations, almost all the Arabic governments are today actually supporters of the United States and of Israel, much more than they are of any kind of Palestinian search for actual independence. Um, I think the Palestinian struggle, because it took place in the Middle East,
Uh-huh.
where the West had its oil interests,
Uh-huh.
and because Israel is a Western state, basically, a state of European settlers, uh, mainly, and with the strong support of the most powerful hegemonic power, the United States. They became quite early on a symbol for geopolitical struggles and the question of international politics, world politics, in a way that the Uyghurs didn't. The Uyghurs, I think they now have become that, but it has only happened after 2017. Whereas for the Palestinians, it basically happened from the very outset. There are different reasons for that, and I think most of them actually just have to do with where they are situated and with the oil politics and the United States involvement. Um, Maybe the Uyghurs could have become so if a real war had broken out between the Soviet Union and the PRC, or if the, the the region had become more volatile after the breakdown of the Soviet Union. But it didn't really happen in that way. Um, and then I would say the Palestinian resistance of the 60s and 70s was very good at connecting to more global anti-colonial movements, such as leftist revolutionary movements in the Middle East, in India, and in Europe also. And they became part of a global fight for justice against imperialism, hegemony, and so on and so forth. And within that, and at the same time, they also became part of an Islamic ummah, defending itself against the kafir, the unbelievers from outside. So I would say first the leftist with the People's Liberation Army, and later, I mean the Palestinian one, not the Chinese one, the PLA, and later the Islamic Ummah. That's what Hamas was. It was also a way of connecting the Palestinian case to a global movement. And they have been quite good at that. And I would say the Uyghurs have been less good at that, or the East Turkestan, generally speaking. And you could say that there were attempts. So Uyghurs have been part of the unrepresented peoples of the UN for a long time. Some of the first Uyghur activists in Istanbul actually went to the Bandung Conference of unaligned states, and there was an attempt to make the Uyghur cause also part of the worldwide cause. Why exactly it didn't work out that way, I'm actually not sure. Maybe in part because there weren't enough Uyghurs in Western countries to push this at the time.
Maybe.
Maybe because those who were there became part of like the establishments there and hoped for support from those states instead of trying to fight in a non-state type of movement.
I think when we approached the West, the activists, you said, Isa Yusupalov, they can participate at the Bandung conference. And
Yes.
later on, he went to the United States. That's exact time when he sent a letter and met with the officials in United States. Nixon went to China. They want to recognize China. So that's why that's a very bad coincidence.
We come into that area because, in a sense, you could say that his mistake was to not stick with Bandung, but
Uh-huh.
to go to the United States. And you can understand why he would do that. But if we look back in history at the way Palestine was carved up between France and Britain, or the Levant was carved up, the way the Soviet Union and PRC sort of split those territories, then you could argue, and also the way, of course, the United States has acted in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and so many places around the world, you could argue it's naive to think that these big powers are actually gonna give you any kind of independence or freedom.
Yeah.
It's naive to think that they're not just going to use you for their purposes and then, let you suffer as you must for the rest of it. So you could say if Isa Elliptikin had stuck to the unaligned movement, um, then maybe the Uyghur cause would today be more
Maybe.
popular in leftist circles and so on and so forth. But of course, that doesn't mean that we would today have a free Turkestan, East Turkestan at all. Doesn't necessarily even mean that the situation would be better or anything like that. But it would probably have meant that the issue would have become internationalized
Yeah.
on a grassroots level and not on a state level earlier. And now you could say that um, the Uyghurs, again, since 2017, but even before that, 2016, going back quite a bit, they have hope for the West and especially the United States to stand up for them and help them establish a state, or at least address the terrible atrocities that have been happening in the Uyghur regions. And that's been their focus. That's been where a lot of their organizations have gotten their funding, and that's sort of been the hope. Um, and it's an understandable hope, of course, because uh, the Uyghurs have a very powerful enemy. So you could say they also need very powerful friends. Um, but unfortunately, it doesn't look like there is that political will amongst these powerful nations to actually um, there is to use them for their own political purposes in order to weaken their opponent, but not to the point where we could actually talk about a state independent state being established or even coming closer. I don't think that's there at all. And then of course now with the situation in Gaza, those Uyghur organizations who aligned themselves so closely with the United States have also taken a hit in their international reputation because they have then kept silent. Not Uyghurs generally. Many Uyghurs have spoken out, and you're one of them about what is happening in Gaza. But the many of the Uyghur organizations have not wanted to provoke the United States, and therefore not spoken out about what's going on. And I think that has damaged the Uyghur cause as a cause worldwide, not irreparably. And I think especially because there are so many, especially young Uyghurs, who speak out about it. Also, young Uyghur organizations who make events about it, and so on and so forth. But I personally see that as the way forward, as more of an anti-colonial global justice movement, and to become part of that, than to align with any of the big heavy players on the geopolitical scene. But of course, they're the ones who have the money, and they are the ones who are ready to finance things. And I completely understand that one wants that money, takes that money, needs that money to be working. But it's a real dilemma. And similar with the Palestinians, um, as we both know, and all Uyghurs know, Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian authorities, so not in Gaza but on the West Bank, has been to China, has spoken very positively of Xi Jinping and the Chinese regime, and even said that what they were doing in Xinjiang or East Turkestan was the right thing and they were fighting against terrorism. It's ridiculous, of course. Luckily, I mean, most Palestinians I know hate the Palestinian authorities anyway. They see the Palestinian authorities as a branch of the Israeli government, basically very similar to um, someone like Noor Bekri or Adil Tournias, who were and are the governors of Xinjiang, who are Uyghurs but educated within the Chinese system and fully serving the Chinese system. Um, so luckily, a lot of Palestinians do not see it like that, but the head of, you could argue, the most important Palestinian organization, the Palestinian authorities, who have some kind of sovereignty over the West Bank, has been saying that. Also, in my view, a big mistake. And again, I understand that they need support and they need money and they need all of that. But I do think it hurts the cause. Yeah, but it's not easy to say what should be done going forward for either of them. We haven't talked so much about armed resistance, but obviously what has been triggered now through Hamas armed resistance in Gaza is a terrible, terrible atrocity, a genocide. But just like I would say, I would compare it to the mass incarcerations of Uyghurs in 2017 to 2020, also something that was triggered or, as we talked about before, taken as excuse to do by the Chinese government to push ahead the colonial agenda of taking territory, getting rid of the people, forcefully assimilating, or in other ways making sure that the legitimacy of ruling over this conquered territory is not put in question.
Even we don't give them excuse, they still intended to wipe out this.
Yes, for sure, and that's the drive of settler colonialism. That's the goal. That is what eventually will happen. It's just the question is how fast, in which ways. Yeah. So today, for instance, you go into a bookstore in East Turkestan and you will not find probably one Uyghur novel written by an Uyghur in Uyghur. You will find novels translated into Uyghur from Chinese or from other languages, but all of the original Uyghur produced literary culture is completely gone. And that's something that changed in 2017. Up until 2017, there were plenty of Uyghur novels being printed every year, being distributed, but they had already stopped Uyghur language education in the schools. They had already toned down any kind of Uyghur like kindergartens or anything like that. So they were slowly walking in the direction of this kind of assimilation, but with the mass incarcerations and this whole violent um, policy that came out of what was called the People's War on Terror that started in 2017 and that they said was an answer to these armed attacks and armed forms of resistance. It accelerated. They were able to push it and to basically take it as an excuse to get rid of all these things they probably, some of them, wanted to get rid of for a long time, like Uyghur novels and Uyghur intellectuals who are now in prison for life, some of them sentenced to death, and so on and so forth.
But they were waiting opportunity, not the excuse. Even the Uyghurs do not resist that gradual oppression is there. They're coming to that way, like you said, and then even Uyghurs don't do anything. They're gonna create the excuse. That's a state. They're gonna create the excuse. They're gonna find some kind of excuse to do eradicate
Yes,
Uyghurs.
yes, yes, probably. I mean, if the Uyghurs don't do what they want them to do, which is assimilate
Mhm.
and work for them, accept their narrative, and so on and so forth. But why should the Uyghurs do that? Like, why should they not resist?
Yep.
There is this book by a Palestinian author called Mohammed El Kurd,
Mhm.
and it's called, I have it here actually, it's called The Perfect Victims. And in this, he argues that the Palestinians are always expected to behave as the perfect victims. Only if they just sit at home, don't do anything, and let the Israelis kill and bomb them and their children, are they considered human. The moment they try to resist, the moment they do anything against it, the moment they say, no, you're not coming into my home, and they throw a rock or they push the soldier away or something like that, then the world sees it as, yeah, okay, then they can be they can be killed, they can be bombed. Um, this this book, and I think that speaks volumes to the way Uyghurs not only have been seen by China and portrayed even in international media, but unfortunately also the way many Uyghurs see themselves. They say, "Oh, but Uyghurs never did anything. We didn't.
Mhm.
Why should they not? And if they did, if they resisted, if they tried to free their own homeland, if they tried to push back against forced assimilation, if they resisted in various different ways, why should that not be okay? Why should they only be recognized as supportable, as human, as people who deserve um, their own place and self rule and who deserve to be treated according to human rights if they behave and play the perfect victims? None of us are perfect victims. If you come and you try to kill my father and you try to rob my son and take him to a reservation or a orphanage, of course I'm going to resist, and that is part of
Yeah, the resistance
being
is
human.
should be these people's the resistance should be these people's legitimate rights. Israel killing Palestinian people and China killing and oppressing Uyghur people, and like you said, why should not we resist? That's our legitimate rights. We we're defending ourselves actually. They
Yes,
occupied these lands.
and the moment you resist in the settler colonial context, that moment the colonial power uses violence and force against you and makes sure that what they say want to happen peacefully, which probably they don't anyway, but the modernization, civilizing of the population, which basically means assimilation,
Mhm.
um, that happens faster and with much more violence the moment they get the opportunity to do it. And you're
Yeah,
right,
like
it
you
is
just
about opportunity.
Yep. Like you just to say it, you mentioned that the Chinese government supports the Palestinian people and United States supporting the Uyghur people of East Turkestan. So in this situation, both Palestinians and the East Turkestanian people may feel compelled to align it with their respective allies to advance their national interests, right? So because currently international community is very weak and the superpowers has more influence than whole international community, so they compel it to take side with their respective alliances, so things
Right.
become sometimes like your injustices is my justice in this case, right?
Right.
But I totally agree with you. I believe no matter what, we should stand the right side of the history. Same for the Palestinian people. They should
Yes.
criticize both Israeli occupation and the Chinese repression of Uyghurs, but they didn't, and
Yes.
then many other Muslim countries also didn't.
So there are two things I think that are really important in this. First is that we need to distinguish between the people, because you said before, you said the all the Arabic people um, are supportive of China and don't support the Uyghurs. I don't think that's true. The Arabic leaderships, the Arabic
No, governments, countries.
governments,
Yeah, I didn't say people. I
yes,
said yeah.
they do, but the people don't. And I even know from, I have a friend who's from Gaza who told me that she learned about the Uyghurs in the mosques in Gaza. And the Friday mosques, they were praying for the Rohingyas, they were praying for the Uyghurs, and they learned about what was going on there. And I think today too, um, both Palestinian activists that I know, Kurdish activists that I know, all kind of groups are very supportive of the Uyghurs as a people, even though their leadership is not. And it's the same for the Uyghurs towards the Palestinians. The Uyghur organizations have not generally stood up for the Palestinians or against the genocide in Gaza, but a lot of Uyghur people have. And I think more and more are adding to that. And then the second thing I want to say, we should have no illusion that China is actually supporting Palestine or that the US is actually supporting the Uyghurs or East Turkestan. So
Mhm,
Israel is, China is trading a lot with Israel. China is supplying drones,
mhm,
drone technology, surveillance technology, cameras, and all kinds of things to Israel. There is military cooperation between China and
exactly.
Israel. And when you compare that to what they are giving the Palestinians, that is merely symbolic. Their actual support lies much more in Israel. And I would say it's similar with the United States and the Uyghurs. Yes, they do, or at least they did give a lot of money to Uyghur activist groups. But if you've looked, even after the United States recognized the Uyghur genocide through um, through Mike Pompeo on his last day in office, the trade between China and the US has been rising. It's in the trillions of dollars. The the diplomatic negotiations about trade and all kinds of other things have been ongoing, but the Uyghurs have not been any issue in that. There's no actual support. The relation to China for the United States is still extremely important, and how many percent tax or tariffs they get or don't get, what kind of rare earth they can take, often actually from Xinjiang or East Turkestan, and so on and so forth. That's on the foreground of their mind. They're not committed to the Uyghur cause at all, just like Israel is in no
Yeah.
way, China is in no way committed to the Palestinian cause. So I think we shouldn't we shouldn't be under the illusion that just like historically that these big countries who are battling
Yeah.
each other geopolitically, that they are actually going to support oppressed, colonized people
Mhm.
for many reasons. One of them being that if they really start supporting the freedom of those people, then the people that they oppress on their own side are also going to have more legitimate claims to their independence and their human rights and their freedom.
Yeah, exactly. In the history, they did the same
Yes.
thing, and then now every state they think about their own state benefit. Yeah. Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Roni. It's a very insightful conversation with you. Thank you so much, and hope
Thank
to
you.
see you again in our programs in the future when you have a time. Thank
Thank you.
you.
Definitely. I would love to come back. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity and for a very inspiring conversation.
Thank you.